My mother-in-law didn't just disapprove of my wedding. She tried to kill my maid of honor. I'm Emily, 29. Hours before I walked down the aisle, my caterer handed me a revised cake order I never signed. The new recipe added almond extract, deadly for my maid of honor's nut allergy. The call came from my husband's mother. But Sandra didn't know the woman she was trying to poison was her own goddaughter. This is not a story about a ruined cake. It's about a wedding where the deepest betrayal came from the one person who was supposed to be family. Emily's quiet composure masked a resolve that would turn a signed catering contract into a weapon and a wedding toast into a public reckoning. But to understand how a mother-in-law could justify attempted murder, you have to go back to the moment Emily first told Sandra that her maid of honor couldn't eat nuts. The first time I told Sandra about Claire's allergy, she laughed. Not a cruel laugh. The kind of laugh that says you are being dramatic and everyone knows it. It was a Sunday dinner in early February, 6 months before the wedding. I had explained carefully that my maid of honor could die from trace amounts of tree nuts, that even a shared serving utensil could send her into anaphylaxis. Sandra set down her fork, tilted her head at me like I was a child telling a tall tale, and said, "In my day, people just ate what they were served." Andrew squeezed my hand under the table. He had been bracing for this. His mother, Sandra, was a woman who believed allergies were a failure of character, not a medical condition. She had spent 30 years as a high school principal, ruling hallways with a stare that could freeze a 14-year-old at 20 paces. Her opinions were facts. Her judgments were final. And her son marrying me, a woman she considered beneath him, was a personal insult she never bothered to hide. I met Andrew 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's gallery opening. He was a structural engineer with quiet confidence. I was a freelance graphic designer, piecing together a living project by project. Sandra took one look at my career and decided I was unstable. She wanted a daughter-in-law with a law degree and a trust fund. I had a MacBook, a rented apartment, and exactly zero tolerance for being controlled. The engagement announcement was polite disaster. Sandra smiled for photos but spent the entire evening telling relatives that Andrew was rushing into things. At the engagement party, she asked me, in front of 12 people, whether I had ever considered a more reliable profession. Andrew stepped in before I could respond. My mother, who had flown in from Seattle, watched Sandra with the eyes of a woman who had raised 2 daughters alone. She pulled me aside later and said, "That woman will test you at your wedding. Be ready." I wish I had known how literally she meant it. Claire was my anchor through all of it. We had been best friends since freshman year of college, the kind of friends who don't need to speak to communicate. She was the first person I called when Andrew proposed. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Her nut allergy had been part of our friendship from day one. I learned to check every label, every menu, every ingredient. I carried an extra EpiPen in my bag as naturally as I carried chapstick. When I asked her to be my maid of honor, she cried. Then she made me promise not to serve anything with almonds at the reception, or I will die dramatically right there on the dance floor, and it will ruin your photos. We laughed. But the stakes were never funny. Sandra knew all of this. She had been Claire's godmother since Claire was baptized at St. Anne's, 30 years ago. Sandra and Claire's mother had been college roommates, lifelong friends. Sandra had held Claire as a baby, attended her confirmation, sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. She knew about the allergy. She had witnessed a scare once when Claire was 12 and accidentally ate a cookie with walnuts at a church picnic. Sandra had been the one to call 911. She had seen the blue lips, the gasping, the paramedics rushing in. So when I sat at that February dinner and told her directly, "No nuts anywhere at our wedding," I assumed I was stating the obvious. I was not asking for a favor. I was not being difficult. I was protecting her goddaughter. Sandra's reaction told me everything I needed to know. The allergy, like my career, like me, was an inconvenience she would not take seriously. By April, the wedding plans were in motion. We booked a venue, a restored barn with exposed beams and string lights 40 minutes north of the city. We hired Margaret, a caterer with an impeccable reputation and a detailed contract system. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 50s who had survived decades in the wedding industry by documenting everything. She asked about dietary restrictions during our first meeting. I handed her a typed list. Claire's allergy was at the top, circled, highlighted, with a note specifying cross-contamination protocols. Margaret nodded, made copies, and attached the list to her signed contract. "When I make a promise," Margaret said, locking eyes with me, "I keep it. No nuts in my kitchen that week. Period." I felt a wave of relief so deep it almost brought me to tears. Someone was finally taking this seriously. Then Sandra got involved. She called me on a Thursday evening in late May. Her voice had that artificial warmth she used when she wanted something. "Emily, I'd love to help with the final details. The cake especially, I know a baker. Let me handle it as my gift to you both." Every instinct screamed no, but Andrew asked me to consider it. "It's her way of extending an olive branch," he said. "Let her handle the cake. What's the harm?" The harm, I would learn later, was that Sandra had already called Margaret pretending to be me, requesting a revision to the cake order. She provided my name, my wedding date, even my contract number, which she must have photographed during a visit to our apartment. She told Margaret to add almond extract to the frosting for a richer flavor profile. She said it was a last-minute decision, that I was too busy to call myself, that she was helping out as mother of the groom. Margaret, who had recorded the original order and noted every phone number on file, did something most caterers wouldn't. She paused. The voice asking for the change didn't match the voice she remembered from the tasting. The number on the caller ID didn't match the primary contact number on the contract, so she didn't alter the kitchen order. She flagged it. She pulled the original signed paperwork. And then she called me. The phone rang at 9:43 in the morning, 3 days before the wedding. I was addressing envelopes at the kitchen table. When I saw Margaret's name on the screen, I assumed it was a routine confirmation call. I answered with a cheerful hello. Margaret's voice was clipped, professional, but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "Emily," she said, "I need you to confirm something for me. Did you authorize a recipe change to your wedding cake yesterday afternoon?" I stopped breathing. "What change?" She paused. "A woman called requesting almond extract be added to the frosting. She had your details. She claimed she was calling on your behalf." My hand went cold around the phone. I stared at the stack of envelopes, the neat handwriting, the stamps with little roses, everything blurring. "I didn't authorize that," I said. "I would never authorize that. Almonds could kill my maid of honor." There was a silence on Margaret's end. Then very carefully she said, "That's what I thought. The number on the caller ID belongs to a Sandra Keating. Does that name mean something to you?" I closed my eyes. The betrayal wasn't subtle. It was a knife aimed directly at Claire's heart. And it was held by the woman who had been her godmother for 30 years. I sat there for a full minute, the phone still pressed to my ear, Margaret saying my name softly. "Emily, are you still there?" I was, and I was piecing together something that would change everything. Margaret walked me through the timeline. The call had come in at 2:15 the previous afternoon. The woman identified herself as Emily Pearson, gave my wedding date, my venue, and the contract number for the Dooley Barn reception. She claimed there had been a last-minute change. The bride wanted a richer buttercream. Almond extract was the secret. Could the kitchen adjust the frosting recipe immediately? She didn't stutter. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what to say to sound like me. Margaret asked me, "Do you want me to cancel the order entirely? We can pivot to a different baker. I know people." For a moment, I considered it. Cancel the cake. Call the police. Let the whole thing explode 3 days before my wedding. But then I thought about Sandra's face at that February dinner. The way she had smiled when she said, "In my day, people just ate what they were served." She had been planning something like this for months. If I stopped it quietly, she would simply try again somewhere else. At the rehearsal dinner. At the baby shower down the road. At every family gathering for the rest of our lives. No, she needed to be seen. I told Margaret, "Don't change a thing about the cake. Serve the original order exactly as we signed it, but I want you to bring the revised order details and your call log to the reception. I want the evidence in your hand." Margaret understood immediately. "I'll have everything printed and in a sealed envelope," she said. "No one will see it until you say so." I hung up and called Andrew. He was at work, reviewing structural drawings for a bridge project. I could hear the fluorescent hum of his office in the background. I told him everything, every word. His silence was heavier than any scream. "Emily," he finally said, "are you absolutely certain it was my mother?" "I have the phone number, Andrew. I have the recording of the call history." Margaret checked it twice. He breathed out slowly. "I'm coming home." What happened over the next 2 days was a slow-motion detonation. Andrew confronted his mother over the phone that evening. I sat next to him at our kitchen table, listening through the speaker. She denied everything. Her voice was sharp, offended. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? I was trying to help. I called the caterer to check on the cake, nothing more. They must have misunderstood." Andrew asked her directly. "Did you request almond extract, Mom? Yes or no?" A pause. Then, "I might have mentioned it in passing. As a suggestion. The girl is always so dramatic about her little allergy." I thought a tiny amount might be fine. You know these things are exaggerated. Andrew's hand tightened around mine until his knuckles went white. Claire nearly died when she was 12. You were there. You held her while the paramedics worked. Sandra's response was ice. That was years ago. She's an adult now. She should have outgrown it. Most people do. That was the moment Andrew's face changed. Something behind his eyes went cold and still, like a door closing forever. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply said, "You're no longer welcome at our wedding. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk." He hung up before she could respond. Then he stared at the wall for 10 minutes without speaking. But I knew Sandra. She would not accept banishment. A woman who had spent decades controlling every room she entered would not quietly disappear from her only son's wedding. She would show up. She would make a scene. And she would spin the story to make herself the victim. So Andrew and I made a decision. We would not ban her. We would let her come. She would sit in that reception hall believing her plan had worked. She would watch the cake being served, thinking almond extract was circulating through the room, heading straight toward her goddaughter's plate. And then, when the moment was right, we would show everyone exactly who Sandra Keating really was. The hardest part was not telling Claire. She deserved to know that her godmother had tried to kill her. But I needed her to be present, to be safe, and to be surprised when the truth came out. If I told her beforehand, she might confront Sandra immediately, and the public reckoning would dissolve into private chaos. I made the choice to protect the reveal at the cost of her temporary trust. It was the cruelest decision I made during that entire ordeal, and I still carry the weight of it. Instead, I called Claire's husband, Marcus. I told him everything. He was a paramedic, calm under pressure, and he had carried an EpiPen for his wife since their first date. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "I'll be carrying 2 injectors at the wedding. I'll sit next to her. Nothing will reach her plate without me checking first." Then he paused. "Emily, are you sure you want her in that room?" "No," I admitted. "But she has to witness the fall. She has to know she can't hide anymore." Marcus agreed to keep the secret until after the toast. He would protect Claire without her knowing she was being protected. That kind of quiet love is something I'll never forget. The morning of the wedding, Margaret arrived at the venue at 6 a.m. She personally inspected every ingredient, every utensil, every surface in the kitchen. She placed the original signed contract and the call log in a sealed envelope and handed it to my sister, who was tasked with guarding it until the reception. Sandra's attempted revision was time-stamped, logged, and highlighted. There was no ambiguity. The evidence was irrefutable. Sandra arrived at the church in a champagne-colored dress, radiating false warmth. She hugged Andrew at the entrance, kissed his cheek, and told him how handsome he looked. He accepted it stiffly, like a man embracing a stranger. She found her seat in the 3rd row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue during the vows. She played the part of the proud mother so perfectly that half the guests probably thought we had reconciled. I watched her from the altar, my hands steady, my voice clear. I said my vows to Andrew while looking into his eyes and seeing the same resolve that had been growing in me for months. We were both done pretending. The reception began at 5. The barn glowed with string lights and laughter. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and the cake sat on a pedestal table near the dance floor, a 3-tiered vanilla buttermilk cake with honey buttercream decorated with fresh flowers. No almonds, no almond extract. It was exactly the cake I had ordered, the cake Margaret had promised, the cake Sandra believed she had poisoned. I watched Sandra's eyes track the cake as it was wheeled out for the cutting. She smiled. A tight, satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. She thought she had won. She thought Claire was minutes away from a closed airway and a rush to the emergency room, and she was pleased. But here's what Sandra didn't know. She didn't know that Margaret had already shown me something buried in the phone record. The call hadn't just come from Sandra's number. It had come at a time when Sandra was supposed to be at a bridge game with her church group. She had deliberately excused herself, stepped outside the church hall, and phoned a catering company to weaponize a cake against a woman she had known since infancy. The call log showed the duration, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That was how long it took her to attempt murder. And when Margaret had pressed for clarification during the call, "Just to confirm, you are requesting almond extract, which is a tree nut derivative." Sandra had replied, without hesitation, "Yes, that's correct." Margaret had written that exchange verbatim in her notes. She had even noted the caller's tone, patient, pleasant, unhurried. Sandra wasn't naive about allergies, she wasn't forgetful, she was deliberate, and she had forgotten that caterers document everything. The moment of the toast approached. Andrew stood and tapped his glass. The room quieted. I looked across the sea of faces, my mother, my sister, Marcus beside Claire, Margaret standing near the kitchen door with the envelope in her hand. And Sandra, seated at the family table, her champagne glass raised, her expression serene. I lifted my own glass. My voice was calm. Before we celebrate tonight, I said, I want to thank someone who saved a life at this wedding without anyone knowing. Sandra's champagne glass stopped midair. And I have two documents here that I think everyone should see. I pulled the envelope from beneath the table. Every eye in the barn followed my hand. Sandra's smile didn't falter because she still believed she was about to watch her plan succeed. She thought I was going to thank a florist or read a telegram from a distant relative. I unfolded the two sheets of paper. The first was the original cake contract, signed by me, by Andrew, and by Margaret with the allergy specifications highlighted in yellow. The second was Margaret's call log, the entry from May 29th printed in crisp black ink. I held them up. This is the order I signed 3 months ago. It specifies a nut-free cake because my maid of honor has a severe tree nut allergy. She carries an EpiPen everywhere she goes. Even a trace amount of almond could close her throat in minutes. I made this clear to everyone involved. I paused and let the silence stretch. Sandra's smile stiffened at the corners. Her champagne glass descended slowly toward the table. Now look at this second document, I continued. 3 days ago, someone called my caterer and asked them to add almond extract to the frosting. That person gave my name, my wedding date, and my contract number. Margaret, my caterer, took notes on the call. She recorded the phone number. She wrote down exactly what was said. I turned toward the kitchen door. Margaret stepped forward, her expression grim. She didn't need a script. She had lived this moment 100 times in her head. The caller identified herself as the bride, Margaret said, her voice clear and steady. She requested almond extract for a richer buttercream. When I asked to confirm, given the allergy restriction on file, she said yes without hesitation. The number she called from belongs to the groom's mother. The room inhaled. A collective, sharp draw of breath that sucked the warmth out of the barn. Heads swiveled toward Sandra. She rose from her seat with the practiced outrage of a woman who had spent a lifetime escaping accountability. This is absurd, she said. She looked around the room, searching for allies, her voice pitching into wounded offense. I called to check on the cake. I may have mentioned almonds in passing, a simple suggestion, nothing more. How dare you turn a kindness into something so grotesque? I didn't argue. I let Margaret's silence do the work. Then I turned toward the table where Claire sat, her face confused, her hand resting in Marcus's. She had no idea what was coming. To her, this was still a confrontation about a catering mix-up, not an assassination attempt. You see, I said, my voice lowering, the maid of honor I mentioned is my best friend Claire. And what Sandra didn't bother to ask when she made that call, what she was too consumed by her own hatred to check, was who exactly she was trying to poison. I looked at Sandra. Her face was beginning to lose its polished composure. The color was draining from her cheeks, not with guilt but with dawning recognition. Because Claire was standing now, and Sandra was seeing her, really seeing her, the girl whose confirmation she had attended, the 12-year-old she had held while paramedics fought to restart her breathing, the child whose baptismal candle she had promised to keep lit as her godmother. Claire, I said, did you know your godmother tried to kill you on my wedding day? The words hit the room like a glass shattering. Claire's mouth opened. She stared at Sandra with a hurt so raw it silenced every guest. Then she looked at me, her eyes filling, her voice barely a whisper. She knew, she was there. She was the one who called the ambulance when I almost died. That was the detail that cracked Sandra open. The room remembered. Church friends, family, neighbors. They had heard the story of little Claire and the walnut cookie and the frantic call to 911. Now the same woman who had played the hero that night stood accused of orchestrating a repeat performance with far deadlier intent. Andrew stood. He had been silent through the toast, letting me control the rhythm. Now he spoke, and his voice held none of the diplomacy that had carried him through 28 years of being a good son. You didn't even check who the maid of honor was, did you, Mom? His use of the word was deliberate, a reminder of what she was supposed to be. You were so desperate to hurt Emily that you never stopped to ask whose life you were threatening. You tried to kill your own goddaughter, without even knowing, because Claire's life didn't matter enough for you to spend 10 seconds on a phone call asking her name. Sandra's mouth moved, but no sound came. The denials she had prepared, the gaslighting, the tears of victimhood, none of it fit the shape of this revelation. She looked at Claire, and for a single moment she saw not a stranger but a child she had once held over a baptismal font. Her face collapsed. This is the thing about malice. It blinds you. Sandra had spent months nursing a grudge against me, feeding it, shaping it into a weapon. She had researched how to impersonate me, how to bypass the caterer's safeguards, how to turn a wedding cake into a delivery system for attempted murder. But she had not spent 1 second considering who the target was. She had reduced the allergy to an abstract restriction, a line on a contract, a weakness to exploit. She forgot that behind every allergy is a real person with a real name and a real history, and that history included her. Claire spoke again, her voice now trembling not with fear but with a grief that bordered on disbelief. You were at my baptism. You put your hand on my head and promised to protect me. I have the photographs. I kept them my whole life thinking you were someone I could trust. She stopped, steadied herself, and added, I almost wore the necklace you gave me for my 16th birthday today, a silver cross. I took it off at the last minute because it didn't match my dress. I would have been sitting here wearing your gift while you waited for my throat to close. That image cut deeper than any accusation I could have made. The room was not just silent now, it was grieving. Grieving the death of the story Sandra had sold everyone for 30 years. The devoted church lady, the caring godmother, the upstanding matriarch. In its place stood a woman who had tried to weaponize a sacrament against the very child she had pledged to guard. Marcus, Claire's husband, stood and placed himself between her and Sandra, his paramedics' calm terrifying in its restraint. You need to leave, he said. Not a request. A directive. Sandra fumbled for her purse. She did not look at anyone. She walked toward the barn door, her heels clicking on the wood, each step a retreat from a life she had just incinerated. Before she crossed the threshold, Andrew called out one final thing. I will not speak to you again until you understand exactly what you tried to do, and I don't know if that day will ever come. She did not turn around. The door closed behind her. Outside, the evening sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields. Inside, the barn was still, and the cake sat on its pedestal, untouched, beautiful, and perfectly safe. But the story didn't end there. Because in the quiet that followed, as Claire began to cry and Marcus held her, as my mother reached for my hand and squeezed, another truth bubbled up from the wreckage. Something that would take months to fully surface, a question that would haunt every family gathering from that moment forward. If Sandra had been willing to kill the goddaughter she claimed to love, what else had she been hiding? What other betrayals lurked beneath the surface of that polished smile? The answer would come slowly, and it would be worse than any of us imagined. The rest of the wedding reception moved like a film on slow shutter. After Sandra disappeared into the night, Claire stood frozen in the center of that barn, her husband's arm around her shoulders, her face a map of betrayal and confusion. I walked to her, and we held each other without speaking. There were no words that could reframe what had just happened. The cake sat untouched on its pedestal, a symbol of everything that had been saved and everything that had been lost. Margaret quietly returned to the kitchen and reappeared moments later with the actual cake-cutting knife. She had removed the flowers from one tier, wiped the blade clean, and nodded at us as if to say, "This is what you ordered. This is what you get." We cut the cake together, Andrew and I, our hands steady, the buttercream soft under the knife. The guests applauded, but it was a strange, heavy applause, the kind that carries relief more than joy. The music restarted, people danced. Claire eventually let Marcus lead her onto the floor, and by the end of the night she was laughing, though her eyes never fully lost their shadow. The next morning, Andrew and I sat on the floor of our hotel suite, still in our robes, coffee growing cold. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. Sandra had called 14 times between midnight and 6 a.m. Text messages filled the notifications. You ruined my relationship with my son. I only wanted to help. Claire's allergy isn't even that bad. You're all so dramatic. I told him to wait, but he read them all aloud, his voice flat. Then he blocked her number. That was when Claire's mother, Patricia, called me. She had left the reception early, upset and overwhelmed, and had spent the night trying to process what happened. Her voice was raw. Emily, I need to tell you something I should have told the family years ago. I put the call on speaker, and Andrew listened. Patricia said, when Claire was 12, the cookie that sent her to the emergency room at the church picnic, it wasn't an accident. Sandra gave it to her, on purpose. The revelation landed like a second blow. Patricia explained that years after the incident, Sandra had admitted it during a private argument. She said she had wanted to test whether Claire's allergy was real. She believed the whole thing was exaggerated, an excuse for attention-seeking behavior, and thought a small amount of walnut would prove her theory. Instead, it nearly killed the child. The family, desperate to keep the peace and preserve appearances, buried the truth. Patricia had carried that shame for over a decade. Now the horrifying logic snapped into place. Sandra's attempt to poison the wedding cake was not a one-off fit of malice. It was a pattern. She had been trying to test Claire her whole life, convinced that the allergy was a fabrication. The wedding provided a stage large enough for her delusion, and I had been the convenient scapegoat. Her hatred of me intersected with her pathological need to prove Claire was lying, and the result was almond extract in frosting meant for her goddaughter's lips. Andrew leaned his head against my shoulder and wept. He wept for the mother he had never truly had, for the sister-like figure Claire had been to him since childhood, and for the realization that the woman who raised him had been quietly dangerous long before any of us understood. He canceled his number the next week and got a new one. He wrote Sandra a letter, not an email, but a physical letter in his own handwriting, telling her that he would not speak to her for 1 year, that he needed that time to grieve, and that any attempt to contact either of us, Claire, or the Walsh family would reset the clock. He mailed it from a post office across town so she wouldn't see the return address. The year that followed was quiet and raw. Andrew entered therapy for the first time. I watched him struggle with guilt he shouldn't have carried, replaying childhood moments for signs he had missed. Claire began her own healing process, working with a counselor who specialized in betrayal trauma. The four of us, me, Andrew, Claire, and Marcus, became a tight unit, a chosen family forged in the wreckage of the one we had lost. Margaret's catering business received a flood of inquiries after her quiet heroism spread through wedding planning circles. We sent her flowers on every holiday. Sandra, meanwhile, became a ghost. Patricia told us she had moved to a smaller town a few hours north. Her church friends who had witnessed the toast firsthand withdrew their support. One by one, the pillars of her social standing crumbled. She sent Andrew a birthday card that autumn, but he returned it unopened. The year was not up. When the anniversary of that no-contact period arrived, Andrew placed a single phone call to his mother. He told her he forgave her, not for her sake, but so the anger would stop poisoning him. He also told her that forgiveness did not mean access. She would not be invited back into our lives unless she underwent psychological evaluation and admitted publicly what she had done. She screamed. She cried. She claimed she was the real victim. Andrew listened, said goodbye, and hung up. We never got that admission. And that, more than anything, is how we knew we had made the right choice. A person who cannot see the knife in her own hand will always find another cake to poison. Our table is smaller now, but everyone seated at it would die for each other, and none of them ever would. I think about Claire's necklace, the silver cross she almost wore that day. She keeps it in a box now, not thrown away but tucked out of sight, a relic of a relationship that was always a costume. Every time I see her laugh without looking over her shoulder, I remember that the truth didn't just save her throat. It saved her from a lie she had been fed since birth, that someone who loves you would never slip poison into your plate and call it a test. Here is what this story forces us to confront. We assume that danger announces itself with a snarl, that the people closest to us would never harm us. But the most insidious betrayals often arrive wrapped in the language of care, a suggestion to improve the frosting, a godmother's silver cross, a smile across a reception hall. Sandra did not look like a monster. She looked like a mother of the groom, a church regular, a woman with laminated recipes and season tickets to the local theater. That is the horror. Evil does not always wear a black hat. Sometimes it wears champagne chiffon and asks for almond extract because it thinks you are exaggerating. The wedding cake was never the point. The point was the lie Sandra believed more fiercely than any truth, that Claire's suffering was not real, that my boundaries were a power play, that her own judgment was so flawless she could override a medical diagnosis with a phone call. That arrogance almost killed a woman she had known since infancy. And it had tried before. What saved Claire was not luck. It was Margaret's meticulousness, a caterer who trusted her gut when a voice did not sound right. It was a paper trail. It was a signature on a contract and a highlighted allergy warning. Systems protect people when human decency fails. That is the lesson I carry, and it is the one I hope you carry too. If this story made you think twice about who is really at your table, please like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read them. They remind me that even the heaviest truths can connect strangers. I am Emily. Thank you for listening.